Picture a room built entirely for standing in. Now fill it with 200 people who are not allowed to sit, not allowed to lean, not allowed to shift their weight from one aching foot to the other, without someone noticing and remembering and repeating it later in a whisper that could end you. Add candle smoke thick enough to sting the eyes, stays laced so tight that some women faint standing upright, and are simply propped between two others until they can be walked out unnoticed, and a queen at the centre of it all who misses nothing, who has trained herself over 20 years to smile at you while calculating exactly how useful you are and exactly how replaceable. That is the drawing room at St. James's. Magnificent, suffocating. A place where you could be presented to royalty in the morning and quietly ruined by evening, and nobody watching would even blink, because ruin here does not look like ruin. It looks like a curtsy, a little too shallow, a word passed along a little too fast. We're going there tonight. Not as visitors gawking at gilt furniture behind a velvet rope. We're living it, one young woman's years inside it, everything she would have carried in her arms, laced against her ribs and locked behind her teeth to survive. Here is the plain truth before we even begin. Being a maid of honour to Queen Caroline of Ansbach was one of the most desired positions a well-born young Englishwoman could hold in the 1730s, and almost nobody who held it made it through unbroken. Some left married off in a hurry to smooth over a scandal. Some left in disgrace, carrying a child that could never be acknowledged. One died of it, quite literally, worn down until her body simply stopped. And the ones who lasted longest, the ones who seemed to thrive, the ones the other maids envied, they were the ones who learned to carry something far heavier than court gossip. A secret. The kind of secret that, if it slipped, would not just cost you your place. It would cost the Queen everything she'd spent a lifetime pretending not to need, dignity, and the last choice over how her own body would be seen. You're about to become one of the women who carried it. Your name is Louisa Fenwick, and you are 17 years old, and it is the spring of 1730 when you first stand in the anteroom outside the Queen's apartments at St. James's Palace, twisting the fingers of your gloves so hard the seams strain. The floor beneath your slippers is polished parquet, laid in a herringbone pattern, and it is cold enough through the thin soles that you can feel it climbing your ankles. Above you, the ceiling is painted with clouds and gilded plasterwork, cherubs holding up swags of fruit that will never rot, gold leaf catching the light from 3 enormous windows. It is the most beautiful room you've ever stood in, and you are terrified of it. Your father is a squire in Norfolk with more debts than acres, and this position exists for you only because your mother's cousin, a woman of the bedchamber named Mrs. Clayton, soon to be Lady Sundon, though nobody calls her that yet, put in a word at the right moment to the right person. You've been told repeatedly on the long coach journey down from Norwich that this is the chance of your life. You have also been told in a lower voice by your mother, gripping your wrist hard enough to leave marks, that you are never, under any circumstances, to repeat anything you hear inside those apartments. Not to your sisters, not to your husband, should you ever get one. Not to your confessor, not to your grave. You did not fully understand what she meant until this exact moment, standing in the cold anteroom, listening to the low hum of voices behind a set of double doors taller than your father's house. A woman appears from those doors. She is perhaps 40, dressed in dove-grey silk with a modest cap, and her face has the particular smoothness of someone who has trained every muscle in it never to show surprise. Miss Fenwick? Not a question. Yes, madam. I am Mrs. Clayton. She looks you over the way a farmer looks over a horse before a purchase. Ankles, posture, the set of your shoulders. You will not faint. Again, not a question. No, madam. Good. Everyone faints eventually. Today is not the day for it. She turns, and you follow the rustle of her skirts through the doors, and the sound that hits you is not what you expected. It is not silence. It is not the hushed reverence you imagined for a royal apartment. It is noise. Dozens of low conversations layered over each other. The click of heels on parquet, the creak of stays, somewhere a small dog barking, and underneath all of it, a smell that will become, over the coming years, the smell you associate more than any other with power. Beeswax candles burning by the 100, hair powder made from scented starch, orange flower water dabbed at wrists and throats to cover what the powder cannot, and beneath even that, faint but unmistakable, the sourness of too many bodies laced too tightly for too many hours, sweating quietly inside silk that cannot be washed, only aired. You will learn within the week that drawing rooms happen twice most weeks, sometimes more, and that they can run 3 or 4 hours without a single person below the rank of Duchess being permitted to sit. You will learn that the Queen herself stands the entire time, moving from group to group, and that if she can stand in her 5th decade with her own private miseries pressing on her, then God help the 17-year-old girl who thinks her feet have earned a rest. Mrs. Clayton, you will call her Lady Sundon by autumn when her husband is finally raised to the peerage, walks you along the edge of the room, close to the wall, where the light from the windows does not quite reach, and the gilt cherubs overhead look faintly grey with candle soot nobody bothers to clean at this height. You will stand here, she says, indicating a spot perhaps 8 feet, from a raised chair that is not quite a throne but wants to be. You will not speak unless spoken to. You will not look directly at Her Majesty unless she looks first at you. You will curtsy when she passes, low enough that your knee nearly touches the floor, and you will hold it until she has gone 3 steps beyond you. Can you manage that? Yes, madam. We shall see. And then the doors at the far end open, and the noise in the room does something strange. It does not stop, but it drops all at once, the way a flock of birds drops when a hawk crosses the sky above them, every conversation continuing but quieter, faster, as though speed might make it less noticeable that everyone in the room has just reorganized their entire attention around a single point. Queen Caroline enters. She's not what you expected from the paintings. The portraits make her regal and serene, a fixed expression of benevolent authority. In person she moves fast, faster than you would think a woman of her rank and years would bother to move, as though there is simply too much to attend to and not enough hours to waste on stateliness. She is stout, her face broad and handsome rather than beautiful, and her eyes move across the room in the first 3 seconds the way your father's steward's eyes move across a field before harvest, cataloguing, assessing, already 3 decisions ahead of where she is standing. She stops in front of a duchess and says something that makes the older woman laugh, genuinely, not the practiced laugh of court flattery. She moves on. She stops beside a foreign ambassador and speaks to him in what you will later learn is fluent French, switching part-way through to German when his French falters, without missing a beat, without anyone in the room quite noticing that she has just conducted an entire diplomatic conversation in 2 languages, while smiling the whole time about something else entirely. She is, You understand within your first 10 minutes at court, formidably intelligent, cleverer than most of the men who advise her, and clever enough to have made sure that fact never threatens any of them. Then her eyes reach you. You drop into the curtsy the way you were taught, knee bent low, head inclined, and you hold it, thighs beginning to shake almost immediately from the strain, counting silently the way Mrs. Clayton told you to. 1, 2, 3 steps of royal footfall passing you by, except the footsteps do not pass. They stop. New, says the Queen. Her voice carries the faintest trace of her native German beneath the English, a rounding of certain vowels that 40 years in this country has not fully worn away. Look at me, child. You look up, still bent in the curtsy, your knee screaming, and meet a pair of pale eyes that are doing something you did not expect. They are not cold, they are curious, in the particular way of someone who has met 10,000 new faces and genuinely still wants to know what is different about this one. Fenwick, the Queen says, before you can even give your name, and you understand, with a small cold drop in your stomach, that she was told your name before you arrived, that someone briefed her, that nothing about this meeting is as spontaneous as it feels. Norfolk stock, Mrs. Clayton's family. Yes, Your Majesty. Your voice comes out smaller than you intended. Stand up properly, girl, before you fall over. Nobody at my court faints in the first quarter hour. That comes later when you've earned the right to be tired. A ripple of laughter moves through the nearby courtiers, quick and obedient, and you understand, again, that cold drop, that this is a joke the Queen has made before, probably many times, to many new girls, and that everyone around her knows to laugh at exactly this volume. You rise. Your knee is shaken so hard you're certain it must be visible through your skirts. Do you dance, Miss Fenwick? A little, Your Majesty. Would you read? Do. The question catches you off guard because nobody has asked you that since you left your governess in Norfolk. Yes, Your Majesty. Novels mostly, and some sermons my mother approves of. We shall have to improve on the sermons, the Queen says, and there is something almost warm in it, something that makes the nearby laughter turn genuine rather than obedient. And then she is moving on, already 3 steps away, already speaking to someone else about something entirely different. And you're left standing with your heart hammering and your knee aching, and the strange dizzy sense that you have just been measured, weighed, and filed away in a mind that will not forget you. Mrs. Clayton appears at your elbow a moment later. She likes you, she says quietly, without any particular warmth of her own. That is good. It is also dangerous. Remember both halves of that sentence, Miss Fenwick, for as long as you are here. You do not yet understand what she means. You will. The drawing room does not end when the Queen leaves it. That is the first hard lesson of your first week, and it arrives in your feet before it arrives in your understanding. You stand for 2 hours and 40 minutes that first day by the clock in the presence chamber. Though nobody tells you the time, you count it later from the striking of a distant church bell. 4 strikes before you entered, and 7 after you finally leave. Your slippers, which fit perfectly when your maid laced them that morning, feel a full size too small by the second hour, your feet swelling inside stockings that grow damp and then cold. Your stays, laced tighter than anything you wore in Norfolk, because Mrs. Clayton inspected you before you entered and had the lacing pulled 2 full inches closer without asking your opinion on the matter. Press a bruise line into your ribs that you will find purple and tender when you finally undress that night. You are not permitted to shift your weight visibly. You learn within the first hour a trick the other maids of honour already know. A slow, almost imperceptible rock from heel to the ball of the foot and back, timed to a count of perhaps 30, so slight that from 3 feet away it looks like stillness. Your legs still ache. Your lower back begins to burn somewhere around the 90-minute mark. A deep, muscular protest that has nowhere to go because you cannot lean against the wall. Leaning is for footmen, not for a maid of honour standing in attendance on the Queen of Great Britain. Beside you, a girl named Sophia Vaughan, older than you by 3 years and already 2 seasons into her post, breathes out through her nose in short controlled bursts whenever the ache gets bad. A trick she teaches you without either of you speaking a word about it. She simply does it loudly enough for you to notice and copy, and when you copy it correctly she gives the faintest nod, eyes still fixed forward, face still arranged into the pleasant blankness the room demands. "You'll get calluses," she murmurs, so quietly it is barely breath, when the Queen's attention has moved to the far end of the room, on your feet first, then somewhere else. You don't understand the second half of that sentence yet. You will, in time, come to understand it as the truest thing anyone tells you in your first month at court. By the time the Queen finally withdraws, sweeping out through the far doors with 2 ladies of the bedchamber trailing her like a wake behind a ship, your whole body feels as though it has been wrung out like washing and hung badly. You want, more than anything in the world, to sit down, to peel off your stockings, to press your palms flat against your throbbing lower back. Instead, Mrs. Clayton catches your elbow before you can even exhale properly. "Not yet, Miss Fenwick. Her Majesty retires now to her closet. You will attend." Your closet in a Norfolk manor house is where linens are kept. You will learn, over the following hour, that the Queen's closet is nothing of the kind. It is a small private set of rooms behind the grand public apartments, and it is where the actual work of being a Queen's body, rather than a Queen's public face, takes place. And it is here, in this smaller and much less gilded space, that you first understand what Mrs. Clayton meant about danger. The closet smells different from the drawing room. Less beeswax, less orange flower, more like a sick room, faintly. A mineral tang of something medicinal beneath the ordinary smells of powder and hair oil, and you will not place it properly for another 2 years. Not until you understand exactly what it is that the Queen's body is quietly, patiently concealing beneath silk and boning and 20 years of careful discipline. 2 bedchamber women are already there when you enter, along with the dresser whose name you will learn is Mrs. Purcell, and together they begin the work of undoing what took over an hour to construct that morning. The outer gown comes off first, heavy silk brocade lifted carefully over the Queen's head with Mrs. Purcell's hands guiding the fabric so it does not catch on the elaborate coiffure beneath. Then the stomacher pinned tight to the stays beneath, unpinned one by one, each pin dropped into a small dish that makes a soft metallic click each time, click, click, click. A rhythm that will become as familiar to you as your own heartbeat by the end of your first year. Then the stays themselves. You're given the task because you are new, because someone must learn it, because the previous girl who held this particular duty married and left 3 weeks before your arrival, and nobody has quite filled the gap of loosening the lacing at the back while Mrs. Purcell holds the front panel steady. Your fingers, still stiff and cold from 2 hours and 40 minutes of standing, fumble at the crossed laces, and you can feel, even through your gloves, the deep grooves the boning has pressed into skin and shift beneath. Slowly, Mrs. Purcell says, not kindly, all at once, and it hurts her worse, not better. You loosen the laces an inch at a time, working upward from the base, and with each loosened inch you hear the Queen's breath change. Not a gasp, nothing so dramatic, but a slow, controlled exhale each time. The sound of a body that has been holding itself rigid for hours finally being permitted in careful stages to soften. And it is in the final stage of loosening, when the stays come away entirely and the Queen stands for a moment in her shift, alone before the linen wrapper is brought, that you see it for the first time. A slight, careful swelling low on her right side, just above the hip, no larger than a small orange, that the Queen's own hand moves to press flat and steady, with a practised, unhurried gesture, the way you might smooth a wrinkle from a tablecloth, as though this is simply a thing her body does now, and has done for some time, and there is no more reason to remark on it than there would be to remark on grey hair. Nobody in the room reacts. Mrs. Purcell continues laying out the wrapper. The two bedchamber women continue their work as though they have seen nothing at all, and you understand, with the sudden cold clarity of someone who has just stepped onto ice and felt it flex, that they have seen this before, many times, and that whatever it is not spoken of, not even here, not even among the 4 or 5 women in the entire kingdom who are permitted to see the Queen's body without its silk and boning armour. The Queen catches you looking. Her eyes meet yours across the small room, and for a moment, one single suspended moment, something passes over her face that is not quite the warm curiosity from the drawing room. It is harder than that. Older. A queen deciding in real time whether the newest girl in her household can be trusted with the one thing in this world she has not yet found a way to control. "Miss Fenwick," she says, and her voice has dropped. "Private, meant only for this small room. You will find in time that a great deal happens in this closet that doesn't happen anywhere else in this palace. What is seen here stays here. I trust you understand me." "Yes, Your Majesty." Your voice comes out steadier than you feel. "I hope so, for your sake as much as mine." The wrapper is brought. The swelling disappears beneath linen and the Queen's own composed expression, and within 20 minutes she's dressed again in a lighter gown for the evening, and the entire episode is folded away as though it never happened, filed into the part of your mind that Mrs. Clayton warned you, on your very first day, would need to grow large enough to hold things you could never repeat. You do not yet know what the swelling is. You will not know for certain for nearly 7 years, but you carry the shape of it home with you that first night, pressed into your memory the way the stays pressed their grooves into your ribs, and something in you understands, even without the words for it yet, that you have just been handed the beginning of the heaviest thing you will ever carry. The attic room you share at St. James's with 2 other maids of honour is nothing like the closet, and nothing like the drawing room either. It is cramped under the roofline, the ceiling sloping so sharply on one side that only the shortest of the 3 of you, a round-faced girl called Bridget, from an Irish family with more pride than money, can stand upright against the wall without stooping. There is a single small window that does not quite close properly, so that in winter a thread of freezing air finds its way in no matter how many rags you stuff along the sill, and in summer the same gap lets in the noise of the city below, hawkers, carriage wheels, the distant tolling of bells marking hours you have long since stopped bothering to count. Sophia Vaughan has the bed nearest the window. She has earned it, she tells you the first night, by surviving 2 years longer at court than either of you, and there is something in the way she says it, half joke, half genuine claim of seniority, that makes you like her immediately before you understand how dangerous liking her will eventually become. You'll want to know the rules, she says that first night, sitting cross-legged on her narrow bed while you both peel off stockings gone grey with a full day's wear, rubbing feeling back into toes that have gone half numb. Not the ones Mrs. Clayton tells you, the real ones. Go on then. Rule 1. Never be alone with the king. She says it flatly, without drama, the way you might warn someone about a loose stare. Not in a corridor, not in a garden, not for a minute, however innocent it seems. He likes young faces. He likes them especially when the Queen isn't watching, though she is always watching, one way or another, even from another room. If he corners you, you curtsy, you answer whatever he asks in the fewest words that are still polite, and you find the nearest excuse to leave. Do not laugh at his jokes too warmly. Do not let him see you flustered. Flustered looks like flattered from a distance, and flattered is a rumour that will outlive your whole career here. You think of the king, whom you have only glimpsed twice so far, a short, choleric man with a florid face and a habit of walking so fast through the palace corridors that his attendants half jog to keep pace. Famous, you have already heard this from 3 separate people in your first week, for keeping his watch in his hand during any conversation that bores him, so that whoever he is speaking with can watch him time their own irrelevance. Rule 2, Sophia continues, never let the Prince of Wales single you out either, though for entirely different reasons. Frederick hates his parents with a completeness that would be almost admirable if it weren't so exhausting to be near. Anything you say to him, assume it will be repeated to his own little rival court at Leicester House within the week, twisted to make his mother look foolish. He collects grievances against her the way other men collect snuff boxes. And rule 3, Sophia's face changes just slightly, the joking edge softening into something more careful. Rule 3 is the one that actually matters. Whatever you see in that closet, and you'll see plenty, working under Mrs. Clayton, you carry it to your grave. I mean that literally, Louisa. Not to your mother, not to your confessor, not to the man you eventually marry, however much you trust him in the moment. The women who talk don't get dismissed quietly. They get dismissed loudly enough that nobody ever hires them again, anywhere, for anything. Ruined reputations travel faster than any coach. You think of the swelling you saw that first evening, the Queen's own hand pressing it flat with that terrible, practised calm, and something in your stomach tightens. Has anyone talked? One girl, before your time, whispered something to her sister about, well, it doesn't matter what precisely. What matters is that within a month, her family's name was mud in 3 counties. Her betrothal was broken, and she ended up companion to some elderly aunt in Shropshire, unmarried, forgotten. The Queen didn't even have to say a word publicly. Word simply travels. Once it starts, and nobody traces it back to where it began. Bridget, from her own narrow bed, adds quietly, without looking up from the stocking she's darning by candlelight, Sophia's not exaggerating. My cousin knew the family. You lie awake a long while that first night, listening to the wind worry at the ill-fitting window, feeling the ache in your feet and lower back settle into something duller, more permanent, and turning over in your mind the shape of the world you've just stepped into, a world where the greatest danger is not poverty, not illness, not even the king's wandering eye, but simply knowing too much and being unable to prove you have forgotten it. Over the following weeks, you learn the court the way you once learned your catechism, by repetition, and small humiliations that eventually harden into competence. You learn that Mary Bellenden, one of the most celebrated beauties among the previous generation of maids of honour, escaped court only by marrying in such haste and secrecy that the Queen did not learn of the wedding until it was already accomplished. A small act of rebellion still spoken of admiringly in low voices among the current crop of maids, as proof that escape is at least theoretically possible. You learn that Anne Vane, a maid of honour only a few years your senior, has already left the Queen's household entirely, not through marriage but through scandal so complete it required no gossip to spread it. She is with child by the Prince of Wales himself, installed now in a house of her own near Soho Square. Neither wife nor mistress in any respectable sense, existing in a strange suspended category that the other maids discuss with a mixture of horror and something almost like envy. Because whatever else can be said of Anne Vane's situation, she at least no longer has to stand for 3 hours in a drawing room with her feet screaming inside her slippers. You learn more quietly, more carefully from things half said and expressions carefully controlled about Henrietta Howard, not a maid of honour, but a woman of the bedchamber, deaf in one ear from a childhood illness, married unhappily to a brutal husband from whom the court itself provides her only real refuge, and the king's mistress in every sense that matters except the one where anybody actually says the word aloud. She attends the Queen daily. The Queen, in turn, treats her with a courtesy so precise and so consistent that you cannot tell, watching them together, whether it conceals genuine hatred or something closer to a chilly, exhausted alliance between two women who have both simply decided separately that surviving this marriage in their own ways matters more than performing outrage about it. They need each other, Sophia tells you once, watching the two women together across the width of the presence chamber. Mrs. Howard's face turned slightly to angle her better ear toward whatever the Queen is saying. The king needs somewhere predictable to put his wandering attentions, somewhere that won't produce a bastard heir or a diplomatic incident. The Queen would rather he stray with a woman she can watch and manage than with someone new and unpredictable every season. It isn't love on either side. It's arithmetic. You do not yet fully believe her. You will, by your 3rd year at court, understand it as simple fact. Not all of what the Queen surrounds herself with is danger. This, too, you learn slowly, and it surprises you more than any of the court's cruelties. Twice a week, in the mornings before the public business of the day begins, the Queen retires to a smaller room hung with maps and lined with books in 4 languages, and here a different court gathers entirely. Not courtiers angling for preferment, but men of learning, clergymen and philosophers, and once a mathematician so shabbily dressed that the footmen nearly turned him away at the door before someone recognised the name and hurried to apologise. The Queen reads Locke. She corresponds, you are told, though you never see the letters yourself, with philosophers on the continent, weighing arguments about the nature of the soul with the same close, patient attention she brings to weighing a courtier's true loyalty. You are present once when the talk turns to smallpox, a disease that has already, by the time you arrive at court, taken 2 of the Queen's own relations and left its scars on half the faces in the presence chamber, including, faintly, on your own left cheek, a legacy of a mild case you survived as a child in Norfolk. The Queen speaks of an experiment she authorised years before your arrival, when the practice of variolation, deliberately infecting a person with a mild dose of the disease to protect them from a worse one, was still considered by most physicians in the country to be dangerous foreign superstition. She had it tried first on condemned prisoners at Newgate, offering them pardons in exchange for the risk. And when all 6 survived, she had it tried on orphan children from the parish, and only then, satisfied, did she have her own younger children inoculated. "They called me reckless," she says to the room. "Not particularly to you, though you're standing close enough to hear every word. They call anyone reckless who is willing to test an idea before believing it. I would rather be called reckless once than call myself a fool for the rest of my life over children I could have saved." You think, listening, of the swelling beneath her ribs, hidden and unexamined, and wonder, though you would never say it aloud, not even to Sophia, not even to yourself in full daylight, why a woman brave enough to test smallpox on her own children cannot bring herself to let a surgeon look at her own body. You will spend years arriving at an answer to that question. It will not be a comfortable one. Autumn comes, then a hard winter, and you learn the rhythms of a year at court the way you once learned the rhythms of harvest and lambing in Norfolk. Except here the seasons are marked not by weather, but by the movement of the household between palaces. St. James's for the winter town season, Hampton Court and Richmond in the warmer months, Kensington increasingly favoured as the years pass, each move requiring an entire small army of servants to pack, cart, unpack and arrange, so that the Queen might sit down one evening in a room 3 miles from where she slept the night before and find every book, every letter, every private comfort already restored to precisely its accustomed place. You learn to dress in the dark because your duties often begin before dawn, fumbling with hooks and pins by the faint grey light through the ill-fitting attic window, your fingers clumsy with cold, breath visible in the unheated room until the fire below has had time to warm the whole building through. You learn the particular ache of standing attendance through an entire winter, drawing room in a gown cut for elegance rather than warmth, your arms prickling with gooseflesh beneath thin silk sleeves, while 20 feet away a fire roars in a marble hearth that somehow never seems to throw its heat quite as far as where the Maids of Honour are required to stand. You learn too the particular labour of powdering hair, not your own, which you manage quickly and carelessly each morning with a small puff and a held breath against the choking cloud it raises, but the Queen's, on the mornings when the full formal dressing is required, when you and 2 other women work together over 3/4 of an hour to build the elaborate arrangement fashion demands, your hands, sticky with pomatum, work through sections of hair too fine now, in her middle years, to hold a curl as readily as it once did. The pomatum itself is a thick, faintly rancid paste of rendered fat and beeswax that clings stubbornly under your fingernails, no matter how thoroughly you scrub them afterward. And the powder that follows, fine as flour, scented faintly with orris root, settles into every crease of your knuckles and every fold of your own sleeves, so that by the end of a full dressing morning your hands look older than they are, pale and chalky, the powder working its way into the small cracked places where the winter cold has already split your skin at the joints. Your shoulders ache from holding your arms raised for the better part of an hour, working pins into place one at a time, each pin driven carefully enough not to catch scalp, each small correction, a curl set half an inch too high, a section fallen loose from its careful arrangement, requiring you to unpick and rebuild rather than simply patch over, because the Queen's own sharp eye in the looking-glass catches every imperfection before you do, and a rebuked pin left crooked feels, after enough repetitions, like a genuine small failure rather than the trivial correction it actually is. By the time the arrangement is finally finished and the last cloud of powder has settled, your own arms tremble faintly with the particular fatigue of sustained overhead work, the muscles across your upper back burning in a way no amount of standing alone ever quite produces, and you flex your stiff, powder-pale fingers behind your back where no one can see, working the ache out joint by joint, before folding your hands back into the composed, motionless posture the rest of the morning will demand of you for hours yet to come. You learn the taste of exhaustion so complete it stops feeling like tiredness and starts feeling like a kind of fog behind the eyes, a state in which you can still curtsy correctly, still answer a question in the right tone, still smile at the right moment, while some deeper part of you has simply gone still, waiting only for the moment when you might finally be permitted to close your eyes. And you learn, too, in small pieces gathered over that first winter, more of what the swelling beneath the Queen's ribs actually is. It happened, Mrs. Purcell tells you one night, very quietly, while the two of you fold linen together in the dim closet after the Queen has finally retired. Years ago, during the birth of the Queen's youngest child, a difficult labour that left something torn inside that never fully healed. A rupture, the surgeons of the time called it, though none of them were ever permitted to examine it properly then or since. It is, Mrs. Purcell explains haltingly, choosing her words with the particular care of someone terrified of choosing the wrong ones, a kind of hernia, a place where something inside has worked its way through the wall that ought to hold it, low on the right side, and it has grown slowly over the years, though the Queen has never once acknowledged this to anyone beyond the small handful of women who dress her. Why won't she see a physician properly, you ask? Because it is the only question that matters, and because you are still young enough that first winter to believe questions have answers that make sense. Mrs. Purcell's hands still on the linen. Because a Queen's body is not entirely her own, Miss Fenwick, not in the way yours or mine is. If word got out that something was wrong with her, truly wrong, not the ordinary complaints of age, every ambassador in Europe would begin writing home about the succession within the week. Every enemy of the King's ministry would begin whispering that Walpole's grip on power might be failing along with her. She has decided, and I believe she decided this years ago, long before you or I ever came to court, that her own comfort is a smaller price to pay than that kind of uncertainty let loose in the world. You fold the linen in silence for a while after that, the weight of the words settling somewhere alongside the weight of everything else you are learning to carry. Does the King know? The King knows there is something. I doubt he's ever asked precisely what, and I doubt she has ever precisely told him. It is easier, I think, for them both to leave certain rooms of a marriage permanently locked. The first real danger finds you on a Tuesday in late February, nearly a year into your service, in a corridor at Hampton Court so narrow that two people cannot pass without one of them turning sideways. You are carrying a small stack of the Queen's private correspondence, letters to be sorted before the morning's business, your arms full enough that you cannot easily curtsy without risking the whole stack sliding to the floor when you round a corner and nearly collide with the King himself, moving at his usual furious pace, watch already half out of his waistcoat pocket, as though he is timing his own journey down the corridor. He stops. You freeze, arms full of letters, heart suddenly loud in your own ears. "Well," he says in the clipped, faintly accented English that never fully lost its German edges, looking you over with an attention that makes your skin prickle in a way entirely different from the cold. "Fenwick, is it? Mrs. Clayton's girl?" "Yes, Your Majesty." You manage a nod that is not quite a curtsy, the letters shifting dangerously in your arms. "You look pale, child." Does my wife work you too hard? There is no correct answer to this question, and you've been warned extensively about questions with no correct answer. I am very well, Your Majesty, thank you. He steps closer, not far, no more than half a step. But the corridor is narrow enough that half a step matters, and you can smell now the particular mingled scent of snuff and hair powder and something sharper beneath it, and his eyes are doing something you recognise immediately from Sophia's warning, though recognising it does nothing to make it less frightening. Assessing. Lingering half a second longer than a king's glance at a maid of honour has any reasonable cause to linger. You have a Norfolk face, he says. Honest, I like an honest face. A pause just long enough to feel deliberate. You should attend more often when I'm at cards in the evening. My wife keeps all the interesting company for herself in that little book room of hers. It grows tiresome. Always the same clever faces. Your mouth has gone entirely dry. You think of Sophia's exact words, fewest words that are still polite, and you force your voice steady. Your Majesty is very kind. I fear I am a poor card player, and would only embarrass myself before such fine company. Something flickers across his face. Not quite disappointment, not quite amusement. Some third thing that you will spend years afterward trying to name and never quite manage. Then, as suddenly as he stopped, he is moving again, brushing past you with barely enough room to spare that the letters in your arms tremble, and he has gone down the corridor at his usual furious pace. Watch already back out, timing whatever comes next in his day. You stand alone in the narrow corridor for a long moment. Letters clutch to your chest, legs unsteady in a way that has nothing to do with the standing and everything to do with the particular, specific terror of having just navigated something correctly without any real certainty in the moment that you were navigating it correctly at all. You tell no one except Sophia. That night, in the darkness of the attic room, your voice barely above a whisper, even though Bridget is asleep 3 feet away. You did well, Sophia says when you finish. Truly, Louisa. Most girls freeze entirely the first time. Or worse, they simper, because nobody's ever taught them there's a difference between being noticed and being safe. Does it happen again? After the first time? Sophia is quiet for a moment in the dark. Sometimes. It depends whether he decides you're worth the trouble of pursuing, or whether he's already moved his attention elsewhere. You handled it exactly right, which means, with any luck, he'll simply forget your face by next week. He forgets most of them. It's the ones who don't get forgotten who end up in real trouble. You do not sleep well that night, turning the encounter over and over, cataloguing every word, every half step, every flicker of his expression, trying to determine with the anxious precision of the very young whether you have truly escaped something or merely delayed it. It will be years before you fully understand that you have in fact escaped it, that whatever the king saw in the narrow corridor that Tuesday, honest Norfolk face or not, was simply not quite enough to overcome the effort of pursuit, and that this, too, however cold it sounds, is a kind of mercy in a world built almost entirely from calculated risk. Sophia Vaughan is not so fortunate, though her downfall, when it comes that same spring, has nothing to do with the king at all. It begins small, the way most ruin does. A run of unlucky evenings at cards in the private apartments of a duchess who hosts such things twice weekly, debts accumulating faster than Sophia's small allowance can cover, promissory notes signed in a hand that grows shakier with each fresh humiliation. You watch it happen in pieces, over weeks, the way you might watch a slow leak spread across a ceiling. A borrowed necklace pawned quietly and never quite redeemed in time. A whispered request to you for a loan you cannot possibly afford to make. A creditor's servant appearing at the palace gates once, twice, 3 times, each visit a little more insistent than the last, until finally the whole business reaches near it should never have reached, and Mrs. Clayton summons Sophia to a private interview, from which she emerges an hour later with a face like carved stone. "I have a fortnight," she tells you that night, sitting on the edge of her bed by the window, not crying, her voice flat with something past crying. "A fortnight to settle what I can, and remove myself with what dignity remains. There's a cousin in Devon who will have me if I write the right sort of humble letter. Sophia, don't." She says it gently enough but firmly. "I made my own debts, Louisa. Nobody forced my hand at the card table. I only wish—" She stops, and for a moment something younger and rawer shows through the careful court composure she has worn since your first night here. "I only wish it were the sort of ruin that felt like it happened to me, rather than the sort I built myself, one bad evening at a time." She's gone within the fortnight, exactly as promised, packed into a hired coach with 2 trunks, and a face arranged into careful dignity for the benefit of the servants watching her go. And within a week a new girl has her bed by the window, and within a month her name is rarely spoken above a murmur, filed away into the long unspoken list of maids who did not last. And you understand, watching the space where she used to be, exactly how thin the line runs between the women who survive this world and the women who are quietly, efficiently absorbed by it. By your 2nd summer at court, you've earned enough of the Queen's trust to be included sometimes in her mornings at Richmond, where she keeps her own private gardens separate from the formal grounds. A wilder, stranger sort of landscape than anything in the clipped avenues nearer the house, full of winding paths and artificial grottos that she has commissioned and reworked, year on year, with an enthusiasm that seems, in these quieter hours, entirely separate from the calculating woman who reads a drawing room the way a general reads a battlefield. She walks fast here too, the way she does everywhere, but the speed feels different away from the palace, less like urgency and more like appetite. A woman who has waited all week for these particular mornings and intends to make full use of every one of them. You follow a half step behind, carrying a light shawl she'll not put on even when the morning air still holds the night's chill, past a small ornamental building she calls her hermitage, hung inside with busts of philosophers she admires, and further still to a strange, fanciful structure, built to resemble something between a cave and a cottage, which the workmen and gardeners have taken to calling Merlin's Cave, half in earnest, and half as a joke about the Queen's fondness for old British legends dressed up in new plaster and thatch. "They think it foolish," she says one morning. Not quite to you, gesturing at the little buildings you pass it, waxwork figures of Merlin and his attendants visible through the doorway in the early light. "Half my ministers think it foolish. A queen building grottos and follies instead of attending properly to the business of state." She says this with something close to amusement, the particular dry humour she reserves for moments when nobody important enough to matter is listening. Let them think it. A mind needs somewhere to rest that isn't calculation, Miss Fenwick, or it stops working properly at all the calculation that matters. I have found mine. I suggest you begin looking for yours before this place wears you down to nothing. You think of the attic room, of Sophia gone to Devon, of the ache that has become a permanent resident in your lower back, and the calluses that have indeed appeared, exactly as promised, first on your feet, and then you understand now fully what Sophia meant. Somewhere deeper, a thickening in the part of you that used to flinch at cruelty, and now simply files it away for later consideration. Further along the path, the ground rises slightly toward a stand of old trees, and here the Queen stops entirely, catching her breath in a way she rarely permits herself to do in front of anyone, one hand resting briefly low against her right side in a gesture so quick and so practiced you would miss it entirely if you did not already know what her hand was checking for. "Come look at this," she says, recovering, gesturing you forward to where the trees open onto a view over the river, the Thames catching the morning light in long silver ribbons below, barges moving slow and dark against the brightness of the water, the roofs and spires of Richmond, and further off the smudged grey suggestion of London itself, miles distant, wrapped in its permanent haze of coal smoke. "I had this cut through deliberately," she says. "The trees, I mean. Paid a small fortune to have exactly this much cleared and no more. So the view opens at precisely this point on the path and nowhere before it. My husband thinks it wasteful. I think a queen who cannot choose even the shape of her own view has very little left that is truly hers, and I intend to keep what little that is." You stand beside her a long moment, looking out over the river, the wind carrying the green smell of cut grass and the fainter mineral smell of the water, and something in the moment feels less like attendance on a monarch and more like standing beside an ordinary woman who has simply built herself, out of plaster and thatch and carefully cleared trees, a handful of places in this world where she's permitted briefly to stop performing. "Your Majesty," you say, before you can stop yourself, "does it ever pain you? What I saw that first evening, you do not have the words. Even now, even after a year and a half of carrying the knowledge, the place beneath your ribs." She does not answer immediately. For a moment you fear you've overstepped in some catastrophic career-ending way, and your stomach drops with the particular vertigo of a mistake you cannot take back. Then she says quietly, still looking out over the river rather than at you, "Every day of my life, Miss Fenwick. Some days more than others. There are mornings I cannot straighten fully until well past noon." A pause. "You are the fourth woman now who has seen it and said nothing. I chose each of you carefully, though you may not have realized you were being chosen at all. I find I trust silence better than sympathy. Sympathy wants to fix things. Silence simply lets a person carry on. I would never. I know." She turns, finally, and there is something almost gentle in the look she gives you, the closest thing to genuine warmth you have yet seen cross her face in all your months at court. "That is precisely why you're still here, and why you will remain here longer than most, I think, if you continue as you have begun. Come, we have delayed the gardeners long enough this morning." She walks on, faster again, appetite restored, and you follow a half step behind, carrying the shawl she still will not wear, understanding, with a clarity that settles into you like a stone dropped into still water, rings spreading outward, changing everything it touches, that you have just been told, as plainly as this careful woman is capable of telling anyone anything, that you have become one of the small handful of people in the entire world she has decided to trust with the truth of her own body. It is, you will come to understand over the following years, both the greatest honour of your young life and the heaviest weight you will ever be asked to carry. The years that follow blur together the way years do once you've learned a rhythm well enough to stop counting the individual days inside it. You turn 19, then 20, then 21. Your calluses harden. Your curtsy becomes so automatic you could perform it in your sleep. And once, exhausted past reason after a drawing room that ran nearly 4 hours, you very nearly do, catching yourself mid-dream fog with your knee already bending before you realise the footsteps you heard were only a footman crossing the outer room, not the Queen at all. New girls arrive each year, wide-eyed and stiff with terror in exactly the way you once were, and you find yourself, without quite intending it, becoming the one who murmurs the trick of the slow rock from heel to ball of foot, the one who explains, in the flattest voice you can manage, the 3 rules Sophia once gave you in the dark of that same attic room. Bridget marries in your 3rd year, a modest but respectable match arranged through her family, and leaves court with visible relief, though she writes to you twice a year afterward, letters full of children and household accounts, and a happiness that reads, even through the careful formality of correspondence, as entirely genuine. You do not marry. There is no dramatic reason for it. No broken engagement, no scandal of your own. Simply an absence of opportunity that troubles you less than it perhaps should, and a growing sense, which you would never voice aloud even to Mrs. Purcell, that you have become more useful to the Queen precisely by remaining unmarried, unencumbered, permanently available for the closet work that has become, gradually and without any formal announcement, more yours than anyone else's. You are there, in the small quiet room behind the grand apartments, on the morning in 1734 when Mrs. Howard, Lady Suffolk now, though the title changes nothing about the actual shape of her position, finally, after years of an unhappiness so carefully concealed that most of the court genuinely believed her contentment sincere, requests permission to retire from her post entirely. You watch the interview from the far side of the room, close enough to hear most of it, arranging linen with hands that have long since learned to work slowly and quietly enough not to draw attention to themselves. You are certain, the Queen says, and there is something almost regretful in her voice, though her face gives away nothing at all to anyone who has not spent years learning to read the small tells beneath its composure. It has been a long service, Henrietta, longer than most. 20 years, Your Majesty. Lady Suffolk's voice is steady, though you notice her hands folded before her gripping each other tightly enough to whiten at the knuckles. I find I have very little of myself left to give it. He will not take it well. The Queen does not need to say which he. You understand that leaving him will feel to him like a great deal more than the ending of an arrangement he has grown careless about for years. I understand, Your Majesty, that I have given the greater part of my youth to an arrangement that has cost me a great deal more than it has ever paid me, and I find at last that I would simply like to be an old woman who chooses her own mornings. There is a silence after this that stretches long enough to feel dangerous, and you keep your eyes fixed on the linen in your hands, not daring to look up, though you can feel somehow the particular quality of the silence changing, softening. Go then, the Queen says finally, and her voice has dropped into something almost tender, almost sisterly. 2 women who have spent 2 decades locked in the strangest and most reluctant alliance either of them ever chose, arriving together at last at something like mutual respect. Go and choose your own mornings, Henrietta. God knows you have earned the right. Lady Suffolk leaves court within the month. Her place beside the king is filled, within the year, by a new arrival from Hanover, a plump, cheerful, ambitious woman named Amelie von Valmoden, and the whole cycle begins again. New alliances, new careful arithmetic, new corridors to navigate with fewer words than seem strictly necessary, except that this time you watch it not as a frightened 17-year-old newly arrived from Norfolk, but as a woman of 22 who has learned, slowly and at considerable cost, exactly how this particular machine turns. You are by 1736 senior enough among the maids of honour that new girls defer to you without quite understanding why. Senior enough that Mrs. Clayton, Lady Sundon these 5 years past, trusts you with tasks she would once have kept entirely to herself. Senior enough that the Queen, in the privacy of the closet, has taken to speaking almost freely in your presence, the way a person speaks freely only in front of furniture or family, or the very small handful of people who have proven, over years rather than months, that their silence can be trusted absolutely. The swelling beneath her ribs has grown in these years, though slowly enough that you notice the change only in increments. The way you might notice a child growing taller only when you measure them against a door frame they once fit beneath with room to spare. She winces now sometimes in moments when she believes no one is watching closely enough to see it, rising too quickly from a low chair, turning too sharply to answer a question called from across a room. You watch these small winces accumulate across the years, the way you once watched Sophia's gambling debts accumulate, and you understand with a dread you cannot name to anyone that something is building toward a reckoning, slowly, patiently, the way a debt always eventually comes due. You say nothing. It is, by now, the one skill you have perfected above all others. The last week of July, 1737, arrives hot and close, the kind of heavy summer air that sits over Hampton Court like a held breath. And it is in this heat, on a night you will remember in exact and terrible detail for the rest of your life, that the long, brittle quiet of the royal family's mutual hatred finally cracks open in front of the entire household. Frederick, Prince of Wales, has been at war with his parents for years by this point, a cold, grinding war of slights and countermeasures that everyone at court has grown almost bored of tracking, so consistent has it become. His wife, the Princess Augusta, is heavily pregnant that summer, her confinement expected within weeks, and the Queen, who trusts almost nothing about her son's honesty, and has openly wondered aloud in the privacy of the closet whether Frederick might attempt some trick regarding the birth in order to deny his own mother the satisfaction of witnessing her grandchild's arrival, has made plain that she expects the child to be born at Hampton Court, under her own roof, where the birth can be properly witnessed, and its legitimacy beyond any possible question. You're in the closet late that Sunday evening, sorting linen with Mrs. Purcell by candlelight, when the first sounds of commotion reach you from the courtyard below. Carriage wheels on gravel, voices raised in a register that immediately signals something has gone badly wrong, and beneath it all, faint but unmistakable even through the closed window, a woman's cry of pain that carries the particular quality of labour already well advanced. You learn the full shape of it only the following morning, pieced together from a dozen breathless, half-contradictory accounts among the household staff. But the essential facts never change, no matter how many times you hear them retold. The Princess Augusta went into labour that evening at Hampton Court, precisely as everyone expected, and Frederick, rather than sending immediately for his mother, rather than allowing the birth to proceed under the Queen's own roof as she had explicitly required, instead bundled his wife, already deep in labour, into a closed carriage and drove her through the night over rutted roads, a full 12 miles to St. James's Palace in London, so that the child would be born entirely beyond his mother's presence or control. By the time word reaches the Queen, roused from her own bed near midnight, informed that her son and daughter-in-law have simply vanished from the palace, that a search of Augusta's rooms turned up only an empty bed and a scattering of linen still warm, the princess has already been jolted across 12 miles of summer-baked road in the final agonies of labour, and the household at St. James's entirely unprepared, unwarned, scrambling in the middle of the night to find so much as clean tablecloth to serve as swaddling for a royal infant who was never supposed to be born anywhere but here. You are present in the Queen's bedchamber that night, summoned along with 3 other women the moment the alarm was raised, and you watch her dress with a speed and a controlled fury that frightens you more than any drawing-room performance ever has. No wasted motion, no words beyond the barest necessary instructions. Her face gone entirely rigid, the practised warmth of 20 years' court composure stripped away to reveal something harder and colder, and, beneath it, unmistakably wounded. 12 miles, she says once, to no one in particular, as Mrs. Purcell fastens the final hooks of her travelling gown, her voice flat with an anger too large to fit into ordinary tones. 12 miles of bad road. In her condition, rather than allow me the satisfaction of a single hour in the same house as my own grandchild's birth, he would risk her life, and the child's, sooner than grant me that. Nobody in the room answers her. There is no answer that would help. The carriage is ready within the half hour, and the Queen departs for London still in the deep dark before dawn, taking only Lady Sundon and 1 other lady with her, leaving you and the rest of the household to follow at a more sensible pace the next morning. By the time you arrive at St. James's yourself, the child, a daughter, small and by all accounts remarkably healthy given the circumstances of her arrival, has already been born, delivered in a hastily arranged room with borrowed linens and a household staff working by candlelight to improvise what should have been prepared for weeks in advance. You find the Queen, later that same day, standing at a window in one of the state apartments, looking down at nothing in particular, her face composed once more into its familiar public arrangement, though something in the set of her shoulders has not fully recovered. "She is a healthy child, at least," the Queen says, when she notices you have entered, not quite an invitation to approach, but not a dismissal either. Whatever else my son is willing to risk to spite me, he has not this time cost anyone their life over it. A pause, and something almost bitter crosses her face. Not yet. You do not fully understand in that moment the strange weight she places on that final phrase, not yet, nor how closely it will come, within a matter of months, to describing her own fate rather than her granddaughter's. But you carry the words with you regardless, filed away alongside everything else, and you notice, because by now you notice everything about her, the way a nurse learns to notice a patient's smallest changes, that in the days following the frantic night ride to London, the Queen moves more carefully than usual, one hand drifting more often than before to rest low against her right side, as though the strain and the fury of that night has disturbed something that had been, until then, holding a fragile and precarious balance. You say nothing. You have said nothing for 7 years. But for the first time, watching her stand at that window with her hand pressed quietly to her own ribs, you feel something close to real fear settle into your chest and stay there. It begins, in the end, on an ordinary Wednesday morning in November, and that is somehow the worst part of it, that after everything, After 7 years of watching for the moment, the actual collapse arrives dressed as nothing more than a slightly unsettled stomach after breakfast. The Queen has taken her usual brisk walk in the gardens that morning, despite a bitter wind and a hard frost still silvering the grass, because she has never in your entire memory of her allowed weather to interrupt a habit once fixed, and she returns to her apartments at St. James's with colour high in her cheeks and appetite for breakfast as robust as ever. You're in the outer room when the first sign comes. Not a cry, nothing so dramatic. Only the small domestic sound of a basin being called for in a hurry, and Mrs. Purcell's voice, tight with a carefulness you've learned over the years to recognise as real alarm rather than routine concern. You reach the doorway in time to see the Queen, seated, one hand braced against the table edge, the other pressed flat and hard against her right side in the gesture you have watched her make 1,000 times over 7 years. Except this time the pressing does not ease the pain the way it always has before. Her face has gone the colour of old tallow. "It will pass," she says to the room in general, in a voice pitched for command rather than comfort, the voice she has used on every difficult morning for 2 decades to insist that whatever is happening will simply be endured rather than examined. It has always passed before. It does not pass. By midday the pain has worsened enough that she can no longer entirely disguise it from the household, though she still refuses flatly to allow a physician to examine her properly, permitting only the mildest of remedies. A warmed cloth, a little wine, a tincture Mrs. Purcell has kept on hand for years for exactly such difficult afternoons. You sit with her through the worst of it, your hand held in both of hers hard enough to leave marks, her breath coming in short, controlled bursts that remind you, with a lurch of memory, of the breathing trick Sophia once taught you in your very first winter at court. Except this is not the ache of standing 3 hours in a drawing-room. This is something else entirely, something that makes her whole body curl inward around itself, despite every effort of will to remain composed. By evening, vomiting has set in, and by the second day, when the pain has not eased despite every remedy Mrs. Purcell knows to offer, the king himself, frightened now beneath his usual choleric bluster, pacing the outer room with his watch forgotten entirely in his pocket, finally overrides his wife's stubborn refusal and sends for Dr. Ranby, the king's own sergeant surgeon, a blunt, capable man who arrives already grim-faced from whatever partial account has reached him on the way. You're present, holding a basin, holding linen, holding whatever needs holding, when Dr. Ranby finally examines what you alone, of all the men now crowding into the royal bedchamber, already know to expect, and you watch his face change the moment his hands find the hard, swollen mass low on the right side of her abdomen, a mass grown considerably larger and harder than the small orange-sized swelling you first glimpsed 7 years ago, now angry and taut beneath skin gone tight and shining. "How long?" he asks, not looking up, his voice carefully level in the particular way of a man controlling real alarm. "Has Her Majesty carried this?" Nobody answers immediately. You feel every eye in the room that knows the truth. Mrs. Purcell's, Lady Sunden's, your own. Flick toward the Queen herself, waiting for permission neither given nor withheld. "Years," the Queen says finally, her voice thin now, stripped of its usual command. "Since Prince William's birth. It has never troubled me so before." Dr. Ranby's face tells you, before he says a single word more, exactly how badly this news lands. A rupture concealed for over a decade, grown large and untreated, has finally, under the strain of some recent exertion, You think with a cold drop in your stomach of the frantic midnight ride, the fury and the 12 miles of bad road, become strangulated, the trapped portion of bowel losing its blood, swelling, poisoning, with every hour that passes making the danger worse rather than better. There is no remedy for this but surgery, and no surgery of this kind, in the year 1737, offers anything resembling gentleness. They operate on the 4th day, in the bedchamber itself, because she cannot be moved and will not be moved regardless. 4 surgeons working over her with instruments laid out on a cloth beside the bed. No method of easing the pain beyond a little wine and the sheer desperate effort of holding as still as the agony allows. You are asked to leave the room proper for this. Mercy, you understand later, extended to you specifically, because the Queen herself, even in the depth of this suffering, still finds room to insist that you at least be spared the sight of what is about to happen to her body. But the door does not close entirely, propped ajar by a servant hurrying linens in and out, and you stand in the narrow gap of that opening because you cannot make yourself walk away, and you hear, more than you see, everything that follows. You hear the first cut. You hear more than anything the sound she makes trying not to make a sound. A controlled, terrible exhale through clenched teeth. The same breathing trick you learned as a girl of 17 for enduring 3 hours of standing, deployed now for something so far beyond that ordinary endurance that the comparison feels almost obscene, even as it rises unbidden in your mind. You hear Dr. Ramby's low, steady instructions to the other surgeons, the particular business-like calm of men doing terrible necessary work. You hear once a single sharp cry that she cuts off almost as soon as it begins, swallowed back down by an act of will that you understand, standing frozen in that narrow gap of doorway, to be perhaps the single most extraordinary thing you've ever witnessed a human being do. They find what they feared, a length of bowel strangled and already turning gangrenous, beyond any hope of the era's medicine to properly repair. They do what little can be done, cutting away what can be cut, cleansing what can be cleansed, closing the wound as best surgical practice of the age allows, and they leave her when it's finally over alive, but only barely, and only for a while. She does not improve. Over the following days, further operations follow, each one a fresh agony layered atop the last, the wound refusing to heal cleanly, fever rising and falling, the poison in her blood advancing by degrees that even Dr. Ranby's careful, controlled face can no longer fully disguise from anyone in the household paying attention. You are permitted back into the room in the final week because she asks for you specifically, a request that arrives relayed through Lady Sundon, in a voice gone hoarse from days of managing the household through the worst crisis any of you have ever lived through, and you enter the bedchamber to find the Queen propped against pillows, smaller than you have ever seen her, her face gaunt and yellowish in the candlelight, but her eyes, when they find yours, still holding some fragment of the sharp, assessing intelligence that first measured you across a crowded drawing-room 7 years before. "Fenwick," she says, and her voice is barely more than breath now, but there is, unmistakably, the faintest ghost of the dry humour she once used to soften even the coldest court cruelties. "You look terrified. I have frightened you at last, after 7 years of trying not to." "Your Majesty, don't." The word carries an echo, though you do not consciously place it in the moment, of Sophia Vaughan saying the exact same word in the dark of the attic room years before. The same instinct to cut off comfort that cannot possibly help. I have very little breath left for arguments about how I ought to feel, Louisa. Sit with me instead. You sit. You hold her hand, the same hand that once gripped yours hard enough to leave marks during that first afternoon of pain, now weak and dry and trembling faintly with fever, and you sit through the long hours of that final week the way you once stood through drawing rooms, present still, silent, bearing what must be borne because there is no other choice available to either of you. The king comes to her often in that final week, and it is here, sitting quietly in the corner of the room where you've been permitted to remain, that you witness something you never once expected to see in 7 years of watching the careful, cold arithmetic of this marriage. Something that looks, despite everything, unmistakably like grief. He weeps, this furious choleric man who times other men's conversations by his own watch and cannot walk a palace corridor at anything slower than a near run, weeps openly at her bedside in a way the whole court would find nearly impossible to credit if they could see it. And it is on one of these visits, late in the final week, with only you and Lady Sundon present besides the king himself, that the Queen, gathering what strength remains to her, her voice thinned almost to nothing but her eyes still holding their old clarity, says the words that will, though none of you know it yet, be repeated in some form or another for as long as anyone remembers this reign at all. You must marry again, she says, her hand finding his where it rests on the coverlet. The king's face crumples further. Non, he says in French, the language they have always slipped into for the words that matter most, the language of a courtship half a lifetime gone. J'aurai des maîtresses. I shall have mistresses. And the Queen, even now, even with death visibly gathering in the yellow cast of her skin and the shallow rasp of her breathing, finds room for the dry exact humour that has carried her through 30 years of exactly this kind of careful, resigned arithmetic. Ah, mon Dieu, she says, the ghost of a smile at the corner of her cracked lips. Cela n'empêche pas. That does not prevent it. You do not fully understand, sitting in your corner of the room, whether what passes between them in that exchange is bitterness, or something closer to the strange, hard-won tenderness of two people who have spent 3 decades learning exactly what can and cannot be asked of a marriage built from calculation as much as affection, and who have arrived at the very last at something that at least resembles honesty. She asks in those final days that word of her condition not be sent to Frederick, a final refusal, even here, even now, to extend to her estranged son the ordinary comfort of a mother's deathbed reconciliation. And though several of the household murmur privately that this seems a hard, even cruel decision to carry to the grave, you understand it, better than most, as simply the last exercise of the one thing this woman has spent her entire adult life protecting with everything she had, the right to decide for herself exactly what would and would not be shared, and with whom, and on what terms. She dies on the night of the 20th of November, a Sunday, a little before 11 o'clock, with the king at her side and Lady Sundon and 2 of her daughters in the room, and you kept just beyond the doorway in the same narrow gap where you stood for the surgery 11 days before. Hear the room go from the low murmur of a vigil to a silence of an entirely different and more absolute kind, a silence you recognize instantly and completely, though you have never before, in your 24 years, been close enough to death to know its particular sound. There is no great commotion. No cry rises up through the palace. Word simply spreads, room by room, corridor by corridor, In the hushed, careful way that important news always spreads through a household, built entirely from the management of exactly such moments. And by the time you finally allow yourself to step back from the doorway and sink down onto a bench in the outer room, your legs suddenly unable to hold you upright a moment longer, the candles along the corridor have already, somehow, without any single visible hand doing it, begun to be extinguished one by one, the palace settling itself into the particular hush of formal mourning, even before the household has fully absorbed what has happened. You sit alone in that outer room for a long while in the dark, your hands pressed against your own face, and you find that what comes is not quite grief in the shape you expected, not the clean sorrow of losing someone simply beloved, but something more tangled and exhausting. 7 years of carried secrets suddenly with nowhere left to be carried to. 7 years of watching and measuring and saying nothing finally, abruptly, with nothing further required of you at all. The palace does not stop for grief. Not really. Not even for a queen. This is the second hard lesson you learn that terrible week, close on the heels of the first. By morning, before the body has even been properly laid out for its formal viewing, Lady Sundon finds you still sitting in the outer room, your eyes swollen, your gown creased from a night spent upright on a hard bench, and puts a task into your hands with the same brisk efficiency she has used to run this household for 7 years, grief or no grief. The closet must be cleared, she says. Her private effects, letters, personal items, anything that ought not to pass into the hands of the Lord Chamberlain's clerks without first being sorted by someone who understands what they're looking at. I can think of no one better suited to the task than you, Miss Fenwick. You have earned the right to be trusted with it, if anyone has. You return that same morning to the small private room behind the grand state apartments, and you find it exactly as it was left on the last ordinary morning before the illness began. A shawl draped over a chair back, a half-finished letter on the writing desk in the Queen's own decisive hand, breaking off mid-sentence about some minor matter of household accounts that will now never be resolved. A small dish still holding the pins from a stomacher unpinned for the very last time nearly 2 weeks before, click, 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 a rhythm you will never hear again without your chest tightening. You work through the morning with Mrs. Purcell beside you, sorting letters into careful piles, correspondence with philosophers to be preserved for the family archives, personal notes to be returned to their writers, or quietly burned according to what discretion suggests, household accounts to be handed over to the appropriate clerks. It is careful, exhausting, unglamorous work, made unbearable only by the particular grief of handling, item by item, the small material remains of a life you knew more intimately than almost anyone left living. It is in the bottom drawer of the writing desk, beneath a stack of unremarkable household ledgers, that you find it. A small folded paper, unsealed, unsent, addressed to no one, in the Queen's own hand, but shakier than her usual decisive script, dated only 3 days before the illness began, before the frost-hard walk in the garden, before any of you knew the reckoning was so close. You should not read it. You know this even as your fingers are already unfolding it, and you read it anyway, because 7 years of carrying this woman's most private truth has left you constitutionally incapable, in this one final moment, of setting a piece of her down unexamined. It is not a letter at all, not truly. It is closer to a private accounting, a handful of sentences that read almost like a will drafted for no lawyer's eyes. addressed to some future version of herself that she perhaps half believed she would never actually need. I have carried this thing 11 years. It begins without preamble, without explanation, as though she is continuing a conversation held only inside her own head for over a decade. I do not regret the choice, though I know some among my women think it madness. A queen who is seen to suffer is a queen whose ministers begin planning around her absence before she's even left the room. I would rather die of my own stubbornness than live diminished by other men's certainty that I am dying. There is more, a few further lines about her children, about the king, about a hope, expressed with a plainness that undoes you more than any of the court's careful cruelties ever managed to, that whoever eventually reads this, if anyone ever does, will understand that the silence was never cowardice. It was, she has written, the only power left to me that nobody else could take. You fold the paper back along its original creases, your hands unsteady, and you do not add it to any of the careful piles destined for the Lord Chamberlain's clerks or the family archives. You slip it instead into the lining of your own pocket, where it stays through the rest of that terrible morning's work, and you understand, with the same cold clarity you felt 7 years before in the narrow Hampton Court corridor, that you have just made a choice that cannot be undone, that this one fragment of the truth belongs, now and forever, only to you, the last private thing the Queen ever wrote, and the one thing you will carry, unspoken, for the whole of the rest of your life. Mrs. Purcell notices nothing. Or if she notices, she says nothing, which by now, after 7 years among these women, amounts to precisely the same thing. The body lies in state at the Prince's chamber at Westminster for nearly a month before the funeral itself, and you attend, along with the rest of the surviving household, dressed in black wool so heavy and unfamiliar after years of court silk that it feels, standing in the long, slow-moving line of mourners, almost like a penance for a sin you cannot name. The funeral itself takes place on a bitter December night, the 17th, torches carried through the abbey, casting long unsteady shadows up walls built centuries before either of you were born, and you stand near the back of the great church, close enough to hear, but too far to see clearly, listening to Mr. Handel's anthem rise up into the vaulted dark, music the Queen herself commissioned years before for exactly this purpose, though none of you imagined, hearing it discussed once at a musical evening long ago, that it would be used quite so soon. You learn, in the weeks following, a detail that will stay with you longer than almost anything else about the whole terrible business, that the king, in the depths of his grief, gave instructions for one side of both coffins, his own future one and hers already sealed, to be removable, so that when his own time eventually comes, whenever that may be, the two of them might lie with their bones finally literally mingled together rather than merely side by side. It strikes you when you first hear it as either the most romantic or the most macabre thing you have ever heard a grieving husband arrange, and you turn the thought over for years afterward without ever quite settling on which. The household, once the funeral is finally done, does not simply continue as it was. This is the third hard lesson, and in some ways the cruelest, because it arrives dressed not as tragedy, but as ordinary administrative necessity. There is no new queen to serve. The king, for all his weeping and his careful instructions about mingled bones, shows no sign whatsoever of intending to remarry, and a queen's household without a queen at its centre simply cannot continue in its old shape. Within weeks, the great machine that has organised your entire adult life, the drawing rooms, the closet duties, the careful hierarchy of ladies and women and maids of honour, begins quietly and efficiently to dissolve. Some of the women are reassigned to serve the king's unmarried daughters, the two princesses still resident at court, a lesser posting with a smaller household, and considerably less of the old glittering danger, though considerably less of the old glittering privilege as well. Some receive small pensions and are simply gently released, a polite fiction of gratitude for long service that nonetheless amounts in the end to the same quiet dismissal that claimed Sophia Vaughan years before, only dressed now in kinder language and softened by an actual small income rather than shame alone. You're 24 years old when Lady Sundon calls you into a private interview, in a room considerably smaller and plainer than the grand closet you spent 7 years learning to read like scripture, and informs you, with a gentleness you did not expect from a woman who trained you, on your very first day, to expect danger in every corner of this world, that a modest annual pension has been secured for you, sufficient to live independently, or to bring a small but respectable dowry to whatever marriage you might now choose to pursue, freed at last from the particular gravity that has held your whole young adulthood in careful orbit around a single woman's body and its long-guarded secret. You served her better than almost anyone, Lady Sundon says, and there is something in her voice that sounds, for the first time in 7 years, entirely without calculation. Better than I did, in some ways. I managed the household. You carried the thing itself. You think, standing in that small plain room with your pension papers in hand, of the folded letter still hidden in the lining of your travelling case, of 11 years of a queen's careful silence and 7 years of your own, and you understand, finally, standing at the very edge of the world that has shaped you since you were 17, exactly why so few women who begin this life ever manage to finish it unbroken. It was never really the king's wandering eye that claimed most of them, though that claimed a few. It was never only the gambling debts, though those claimed others. It was this, that the position asked you to carry weight that could never be set down, never shared, never even acknowledged as weight at all, for years at a stretch, while standing perfectly still in a room full of candlelight and silk and smiling at exactly the correct angle. Some women's bodies simply could not sustain it. The standing, the lacing, the sleeplessness. Some women's minds could not sustain it. The secrets, the careful arithmetic, the constant awareness that a single wrong word could unmake a family's whole reputation. And a very few, a rare few, somehow found a way to carry it all the way through to the end, and emerged from the other side of it not broken exactly, but reshaped, permanently, into something harder and quieter and more watchful than the girl who first walked through those doors. You are one of the rare few. You're not entirely certain even now whether that makes you fortunate. You do not return to Norfolk in the end. There is little left there to return to. Your father's small estate long since absorbed by the very debts that first sent you to court 7 years before. Your mother in poor health, your sisters married off to men of modest means, who have neither room nor real inclination to house a spinster aunt with court manners, too fine for their small parlours and too worn down, in other ways, ever to fully explain. Instead, you take a small house in a quiet street not far from St. James's Park, close enough that you can still, on clear mornings, hear the same church bells that once marked the hours of your endless standing, and you live there quietly for nearly 2 years on your pension, doing very little that anyone would consider remarkable, until a widowed clergyman of modest means and gentle disposition, a friend of Mrs. Purcell's own family, is introduced to you at a small dinner and finds himself, over the following months, gradually and then entirely won over by a woman whose reserve he initially mistakes for shyness, and only later comes to understand as something closer to a permanent, careful watchfulness that never quite leaves you, not even decades later, not even in the deepest comfort of your own home. You marry him in the spring of 1740, nearly 3 years after the Queen's death, and you have, over the following decades, 3 children who grow up knowing almost nothing of your years at court, beyond a handful of carefully sanitized stories, the grandeur of the drawing rooms, the strange beauty of Merlin's cave at Richmond, the one time you nearly collided with the king himself in a narrow corridor at Hampton Court, told always with the danger smoothed out of it, framed as a girlish near miss rather than the genuine terror it actually was. You never tell them about the swelling beneath the Queen's ribs. You never tell them about the sound of the first surgical cut, heard through a narrow gap in a doorway you were too frightened and too loyal to walk away from. You never tell them, not even your husband, not even in the deepest privacy of your marriage bed decades later, about the folded letter that has travelled with you, hidden first in the lining of a travelling case and later in the bottom of a small locked writing box, through every house you've ever lived in since that terrible December morning. You take it out sometimes on quiet evenings when the house is asleep, and the particular ache that has settled permanently into your own lower back, a legacy you have always privately believed, of those first years of standing 3 and 4 hours at a stretch, keeps you from sleep as easily as it once kept you awake in a narrow attic bed. You unfold the paper, its creases gone soft and grey with age, and you read again the words a queen once wrote to no one at all, about the silence being the only power nobody else could take from her, and you understand more fully with each passing year exactly what she meant, because you have spent your own long life quietly practicing precisely the same discipline. You're an old woman, past 70, sitting by a different fire in a different decade entirely, the year now 19, an unimaginable stretch of time from that first cold anteroom at St. James's, when your youngest granddaughter, visiting for the summer, curious in the particular restless way of a girl not much younger than you were yourself when you first arrived at court, finds the small locked writing box while helping you sort through old linens, and asks with the fearless directness only the very young ever quite manage, what secret an old woman could possibly still be keeping after all these years. You consider for a long moment saying nothing at all, the way you've said nothing for the better part of a lifetime. But something in her face, not quite Sophia Vaughan's face, not quite the Queen's, but carrying some faint echo of both, that same restless hunger to understand a world just beyond her reach, softens the old discipline just enough. When I was not much older than you tell her, and your voice, thinned now by age the way the Queen's own voice thinned in her final week, still carries something of the old steadiness. I served a queen who taught me that the hardest work a woman can do is not the standing, though God knows the standing was hard enough. It is learning what to carry silently, and for how long, and at what cost to yourself, so that someone else's dignity might survive a little longer than it otherwise would. Is that what's in the box? You look at the small locked writing box for a long moment, feeling the old familiar weight of it settle over you one final time. Some of it, you say, not all of it. Some things, my dear, are meant to end with the person who carried them, and not a moment before. You do not open the box that evening, and your granddaughter, disappointed but respectful of the particular firmness in your voice, does not ask again. But you find yourself thinking, in the weeks that follow, more often than you've allowed yourself to think in years, of that first terrified curtsy in the cold anteroom, of Sophia's whispered rules in the dark, of the swelling pressed flat beneath a queen's steady, practised hand, of Merlin's cave and the carefully cleared view over the Thames, of the sound of a first surgical cut heard through a narrow gap in a doorway, of 2 coffins built with removable sides so that 2 people who spent 30 years locked in careful, exhausting, genuine partnership might finally, after death, be permitted to rest with their bones mingled together at last. You think, too, of all the other girls who came through those same tall doors across your own 7 years and never made it through a single full season. The ones ruined by a wandering royal eye they could not deflect quickly enough. The ones undone by their own gambling debts. The ones simply worn down by standing until their bodies or their nerve finally gave out. You outlasted them not because you were stronger precisely, though perhaps you were, in some particular narrow way. You outlasted them because you learned, faster and more completely than most, the one lesson that mattered above every other lesson the court ever taught. That survival there was never about being seen. It was about learning exactly what to carry, and exactly how to carry it, so quietly that even the weight of it eventually became invisible to everyone but yourself. There was another cost too, one you rarely spoke of even to yourself in later years, though your own body carried the evidence of it for the rest of your life: the particular danger of the paint. Every woman at court wore it, in one degree or another, a thick white cosmetic ground from white lead and vinegar that smoothed the complexion into the fashionable pallor the age demanded, covering the faint pockmarks left by smallpox, evening out the flush of exertion after hours of standing, and you wore it too dutifully, every single day of your 7 years, layering it thin across your cheeks and throat with a small damp sponge each morning in the grey attic light, feeling its cool, slightly gritty texture settle into your skin and stiffen faintly as it dried, the way a thin coat of plaster stiffens on a wall. You did not know, none of you knew, what the lead in it was quietly doing beneath the surface. The headaches that grew steadily more frequent through your middle years at court, the faint persistent ache in your joints that you attributed, same as everyone else did, to the standing and the cold, the strange metallic taste that sometimes rose in the back of your throat on the longest drawing-room days. You knew only, because everyone at court knew it and few dared name it plainly, that a girl named Charlotte Meynell, 2 years above you in seniority, applied her paint more heavily than most, layer upon layer through her final 2 seasons, chasing a fashionable pallor that grew disturbingly less like elegant pallor and more like genuine sickness with each passing month. Her gums receding, her hands beginning to tremble faintly even when she was not standing still, until finally in her 4th year she collapsed entirely during a drawing-room, folding to the floor mid-curtsy in front of half the assembled court, and was carried out by 2 footmen, while the room, trained to precisely this kind of discreet crisis, simply closed ranks around the gap she left and continued as though nothing at all had happened. She did not return. Word came, weeks later, filtered down through the usual channels of servants' gossip, that travelled faster and more reliably than any official announcement, that she'd been sent to recover with relations in the country, and that the recovery, whatever its true nature, was not expected to be brief. You never learned, in all your years afterward, whether she lived to old age or whether the paint had already done its slow, invisible work too thoroughly by the time anyone thought to stop it. You stopped wearing quite so heavy a hand with your own paint after that, thinning it wherever fashion would permit the thinning to go unnoticed, though you never fully abandoned it. No woman at that court could have, not without inviting exactly the kind of scrutiny none of you could afford. You think of Charlotte Meynell sometimes in your own old age, running your fingers over the faint persistent ache that has settled into your knuckles by your 60th year, and you wonder how much of it is simply age, the ordinary toll of a long life, and how much of it is a debt finally, quietly, coming due from those 7 years of white lead ground fine and worn daily against your skin in the name of looking fashionably, correctly, invisibly pale. There was danger, too, in simply saying the wrong thing to the wrong woman at the wrong moment, a danger that claimed at least as many careers as scandal or debt ever did, though it left no dramatic story behind, only a quiet absence where a familiar face used to stand. You watched it happen to a girl called Frances Delacour in your 4th year, a clever, quick-tongued newcomer who made the mistake at a small private card evening of repeating, lightly, meant only as amusing court gossip, an unflattering remark about a duchess's failing eyesight, not realizing the duchess's own niece sat 2 chairs distant and heard every word. Nothing was said to Frances directly. No formal reprimand ever reached her. But within a month her invitations to the smaller, more intimate gatherings had quietly dried up. Her requests for minor favours from senior household members went mysteriously unanswered, and by the season's end she had resigned her post, citing a family matter that everyone in the household understood, without a word of confirmation from anyone, to be a polite fiction covering something considerably less dignified. You learned, watching these small, quiet ruins accumulate year after year, that the court rarely destroyed anyone with drama. Drama was for the theatre, for the ballad sellers outside Westminster Hall, for the kind of scandal that made its way into printed pamphlets sold on street corners. The court's own preferred method was subtler and in its way considerably crueler, a slow withdrawal of small warmths, one at a time, until the person at the centre of it understood, without ever being told outright, that they had already been quietly erased from the only world they'd ever wanted to belong to, and that the kindest thing left to do was to leave before the erasure became too publicly obvious to survive with any dignity and tact. You survived all of it, the standing, the paint, the whispered rivalries, the king's narrow corridor attentions, the 7 years of a secret heavy enough to have broken lesser women twice over. Not through any particular brilliance, you have come to believe in your own long old age, but through a combination of luck and stubbornness, and the simple, unglamorous discipline of learning, faster than most, exactly which battles were worth fighting, and exactly which silences were worth keeping. The court itself changed, in the years following the Queen's death, in ways that took you some time to fully register. Accustomed as you were to thinking of St. James's and Kensington and Richmond as fixed, permanent, unchanging worlds rather than the fragile arrangements of habit and personality they actually were, the king grew old without her, at a pace that surprised everyone who remembered his restless energy in earlier years, his famous watch-checking impatience gradually softening, in his final decades, into something closer to simple loneliness dressed up in royal formality. Mrs. Walmoden was elevated eventually to a countess in her own right, installed with a permanence that Henrietta Howard's years of careful, deniable arrangement never quite achieved, though you always privately suspected, watching from the safe distance of your own married life. that even she never filled the particular space the Queen's intelligence had once occupied, the sharp, restless mind that could conduct a diplomatic conversation in 2 languages while smiling about something else entirely, that built grottos and follies to give itself somewhere to rest, that tested smallpox inoculation on condemned prisoners rather than risk her own children to an untested idea. You attended, twice, small gatherings in your middle years where the king himself was present, decades after your service ended, an old widower now yourself among a scattering of former courtiers grown similarly grey, and on the second of these occasions, quite by chance, you found yourself briefly alone with him near a window, both of you, it seemed, having drifted away from the noise of the younger conversation toward the same quiet corner. He did not recognize you at first. Why would he, after so many years, among so many faces that had passed through his court in the decades since? But when you gave your name, something flickered behind his eyes, some distant recollection stirring. "Fenwick," he said slowly. "Norfolk stock, my wife's girl." "Yes, Your Majesty." The old curtsy came back to your knees automatically, decades of habit reasserting itself instantly, despite everything that had changed in the years between. He looked at you a long moment, an old man's careful, searching look, entirely different from the assessing glance you had once feared in a narrow Hampton Court corridor. "She trusted very few people with very much, in the end," he said, quietly, almost to himself. "I have wondered, sometimes, over the years, exactly how much she trusted the ones closest to her hands. You said nothing, because by then, saying nothing had become so deeply a part of you that it required no effort at all, and something in your carefully composed silence seemed to answer him more completely than any words could have. He nodded once, slowly, as though a suspicion long held had finally gently been confirmed, and made no further inquiry, and you understood, walking away from that window a few minutes later, that he had known all along in some unspoken way exactly the kind of women his wife had chosen to keep closest to her, and had respected across all those years precisely the silence that had once terrified you into your very first correct answer in that same narrow corridor decades before. You think, too, in these later years, of the ones who left before ever really beginning, the girls who lasted a single season, sometimes barely half of one, whose names you can no longer quite recall in the correct order, but whose particular exits you remember with a clarity that surprises you decades on. There was a girl from Yorkshire in your second year, whose homesickness proved so complete and so unrelenting that she wept quietly into her pillow every single night for 2 months running, until finally her own constitution simply gave out beneath the weight of it. Not scandal, not debt, not the king's wandering eye, but a plain, ordinary grief for a family and a landscape she had never wanted to leave in the first place, and her parents, alarmed by letters home describing a daughter grown thin and hollow-eyed, withdrew her from service before the season's end. No shame in it at all, only a kind of quiet relief on every side that the experiment had ended before it did any lasting harm. There was another, a Scottish girl with a sharp wit that served her badly at a court that prized wit only in careful, controlled doses, who made the mistake of being genuinely, visibly funnier than several senior ladies, whose own reputations for cleverness had gone comfortably unchallenged for years, and who found herself, within a single season, quietly but unmistakably frozen out of every small kindness that made the endless standing and the endless silence bearable. No invitations to the smaller evening gatherings, No warnings passed along about which duchess to avoid on which particular day. No whispered tricks for surviving a 4-hour drawing room on aching feet. She lasted 11 weeks before she resigned, dry-eyed and furious in a way you privately admired more than you ever told her, and married within the year a country gentleman who by all later accounts appreciated her wit considerably more than the court ever had. And there was one you never speak of at all, not even in your own private thoughts if you can help it, a girl whose collapse came not from scandal or homesickness, or frozen-out cruelty, but from something closer to what eventually claimed the Queen herself. A private illness carried silently for fear of what its disclosure might cost her family's standing, worsening by careful degrees through an entire season, while she continued to curtsy correctly and smile at the correct angle and say nothing at all, until the morning she simply did not rise from her narrow bed, and by the time a physician was finally, belatedly summoned, there was nothing left for him to do but confirm what her silence had already quietly decided for her weeks before. You understand her now, better than you understood her at the time, understand the particular calculus that made silence feel safer than disclosure, even when disclosure might have saved her, because you carried for 7 years exactly the same calculus on behalf of someone else's body rather than your own, and you know from the inside precisely how reasonable that terrible arithmetic can come to feel once you've practiced it long enough. This, in the end, is the true answer to the question the title of every such story eventually circles toward. The reason so few young women who walked through those tall gilded doors ever lasted a full season unbroken. It is not any single danger, not the king's eye, not the gambling tables, not the lead paint, not the standing, not even the crushing particular weight of a secret too large to set down. It was all of it together, layered one atop the next, season after season, a court built entirely from the quiet assumption that a young woman's body and her silence were both, in the end, simply resources to be spent in service of something larger than herself. And precious few bodies, precious few silences, could sustain that particular spending for very long before something in them finally, quietly, gave way. You lived to be 78 years old, which is, by the reckoning of your own century, a considerable span, long enough to see the little granddaughter who once asked about the locked writing box grow into a woman herself, long enough to outlive your husband by 11 quiet years, long enough that the world beyond your window changes in ways the girl who once stood terrified in a cold St. James's anteroom could never have imagined. On the last ordinary evening of your life, in a small comfortable room warmed by a fire your granddaughter's own daughter has been taught to keep well tended, you sit in your usual chair with a shawl across your knees and the small locked writing box, at last, open on the table before you. Opened not in secrecy this time, but in the particular calm of someone who has finally decided that some things are better released before the hand that has held them loses its strength entirely. You take out the letter. Its crease is now so soft with age that you must unfold it with great care to keep it from tearing along the old worn lines, and you read it one final time by the low firelight, the words as familiar to you now as your own name, a queen's private accounting of 11 years of silence written to no one, meant for no one, and yet somehow, across 60 years, always meant precisely for the one person careful and trusted enough to still be holding it when it finally needed to be set down. You do not read it aloud to anyone. Some things, you decided long ago, are meant to end with the person who carried them, but you fold it back along its familiar creases one last time, and you place it into the small, careful hands of the fire, and you watch it catch at the edges, curling inward, the ink darkening and vanishing before the paper itself is even fully consumed. 60 years of silence, finally, quietly, released into the same ordinary warmth that has kept this room comfortable through 1,000 ordinary evenings before this one. It is, you think, watching the last corner of it blacken and fall away into ash. Exactly what she would have wanted. Not preserved, not displayed. Simply, finally allowed to be finished. Your own eyes grow heavy not long after, in the particular gentle way of a very old woman at the natural end of a very long day. And you do not fight it the way you once fought exhaustion, through 4-hour drawing rooms on aching, swollen feet. You let it come. Let it come the way it comes to everyone, eventually, in every century, in every palace and every attic room and every small warm parlour, with a fire banked low against the coming night. Let the ache in your knuckles, 60 years carried from white lead ground fine and worn daily against young skin, finally soften into something that no longer needs remembering. Let the old permanent tenderness low along your own ribs. Not a rupture, never that, only the ordinary ache of a body that once stood too many hours too still. Settle at last into simple rest. Centuries will pass. The palaces you knew will change hands, change purposes. Some of them opened eventually to strangers who will walk through the very rooms where you once stood 3 hours at a stretch without the smallest idea of what those floors once cost the women standing on them. The drawing rooms will empty of their candle smoke and their careful cruelties. The grottos at Richmond will crumble, or be rebuilt, or simply be forgotten beneath newer fashions in newer gardens. The particular danger of a queen's narrow closet, and everything it once demanded of the women trusted to stand inside it, will fade from memory so completely that most people, centuries on, will not even know to wonder what it once required. But some things will not change, however far the centuries stretch beyond this one small firelit room. Somewhere, in every age, a young woman will step through an unfamiliar doorway into a world larger and colder than anything she's known before, and will learn, faster than she ever expected to need to, exactly what must be carried and exactly what must never be spoken aloud. Somewhere an old woman will sit by a low fire on her own final ordinary evening, releasing at last some private weight she has carried decades longer than anyone around her ever knew existed. The particular ache of standing too long in service to something larger than yourself, that does not change. The particular relief of finally at the very end being allowed to set it down, that does not change either. So let it come, the way it always comes. Let the fire settle to embers the way it settled in a small firelit room on a night nobody else in the house thought to remember afterward as anything but ordinary. Let the last of the old letters finish their long, slow burning down to ash and silence. Let the ache in feet that once stood 3 hours at a stretch through a drawing room finally, after all these years, stop aching altogether. Let the candles gutter low the way they gutter low in every room at the end of every long day, in every century, in every palace and every cottage and every quiet house on every quiet street. Let your own thoughts slow the way an old woman's thoughts slow at the end of a very long, very full life, not stopping all at once, but softening gradually, the way a fire softens from flame into glow, into the last patient warmth of banked coals that will still, somehow, be there in the morning, however small, however quiet, ready to be built back up again into something bright. You've carried enough for tonight. whatever weight you brought with you into this hour, whatever secret, whatever ache, whatever small private accounting you have been keeping without quite naming it, even to yourself, you're allowed now simply to set it down, the same as Louisa Fenwick set hers down at 78 by a low fire watching 60 years of careful silence finish its burning, the same as a queen set hers down at 54 in a cold November bedchamber, having decided to the very last breath she had strength to spend on the decision that some kinds of power are worth keeping even when they cost you everything else, the same as every tired body in every century has eventually been allowed to do at the true end of every long day of standing and carrying and holding still. Let it come. Good night.